The sound of silver on porcelain was a tiny, sharp violence in the opulent quiet of the Highgrove Estate's conservatory. $100,000 worth of orchids bled their cloying sweetness into the air, mingling with the scent of beeswax from the polished mahogany tables and the faint, mineral tang of champagne. My champagne flute was still full. The bubbles had gone flat. Julian's hand, which had been resting on my thigh under the table, a gesture of supposed solidarity, had retreated a full 10 minutes ago. Now it was curled around a water glass, his knuckles white. Across the table, his mother, Genevieve, was performing warmth. It was a masterful, terrifying performance. Her smile was a perfect, blood-red slash of lipstick, and it never quite reached the arctic blue of her eyes. She was telling a story about her family's last trip to Gushtad, her voice a low, melodious hum designed to include everyone and exclude only me. She tilted her head, a diamond catching the light and throwing a shard of brilliance across my face. And of course, the embroidery on the chalet's linens was simply divine. Not that you'd know, Alara. Your work is more archival, isn't it? The word hung in the air, archival, a synonym for dusty, forgotten, irrelevant. I was a textile conservator, one of the best under 40, specializing in pre-Renaissance tapestries. To Genevieve, this meant I was a glorified mender of old rags. I felt the familiar prickle of heat on my neck. Some of it, I said, my voice flatter than I intended. We mostly focus on preservation. How utilitarian, she murmured, taking a delicate sip of her wine. It wasn't a compliment. It was a dismissal, a neat categorization of my entire existence into a box labeled useful, but plain. Julian shifted beside me. He hated these moments. He loved me, I believed that, but he loved peace more. And peace, in his world, was a synonym for his mother's unchallenged dominion. His love was a well-meaning but insufficient shelter against the storm of her contempt. Then, the conservatory doors opened. A woman stood there, framed by the twilight deepening over the estate's rolling hills. Chloe, Julian's ex-girlfriend. The one he'd dated for 5 years, the one Genevieve still called her other daughter. She was poured into a dress the color of a fresh wound, her blonde hair a halo of calculated perfection. Her presence here, at our rehearsal dinner, was a violation. Genevieve's smile, for the first time, became genuine. Chloe, darling. You made it. Chloe glided towards our table, her eyes flicking to me for a fraction of a second, a flicker of triumphant pity. She kissed Genevieve's cheek, then leaned down to whisper something in Julian's ear. He stiffened. I watched his throat work as he swallowed. He wouldn't look at me. The air grew thick, heavy with the unspoken. The low chatter of the other guests. All friends of Julian's family, all titans of industry and inheritors of old money, seemed to fade into a dull roar in my ears. I focused on the intricate weave of the damask tablecloth, tracing the pattern of acanthus leaves with my eyes. It was a late 19th century reproduction, well-made but lacking the soul of a hand-loomed original. A detail nobody else would notice. A detail that suddenly felt like the only real thing in the room. Genevieve clapped her hands together, a sound like 2 polished stones clicking. Well, this is a predicament, she said, her voice dripping with manufactured concern. It seems we're 1 seat short at the main table. She looked around, her gaze landing on me with the gentle finality of a guillotine. Genevieve's gaze was a physical weight. Alara, darling, you're so practical. You wouldn't mind, would you? She gestured vaguely towards a smaller table near the kitchens, set for the wedding planners and the photographer. The table for the staff. The implication was clear. Chloe was family. I was hired help. My own wedding rehearsal, and I was being demoted. I looked at Julian. His face was a mask of strained apology. Alara, he began, his voice low, pleading. It's just for dinner. Chloe's father is one of Mom's biggest investors. It's complicated. The word he used to excuse every capitulation, every small betrayal. My own dress, a simple silk sheath I'd bought from a vintage shop and tailored myself, suddenly felt cheap and thin under the weight of 100,000 judgmental orchids. Chloe was already sliding into a chair, not mine, but the one next to Julian, forcing the seating to shift. It was a masterful, silent coup. I watched Julian's hand, the one that had abandoned my leg, find Chloe's arm in a gesture of welcome. A casual, familiar touch that felt like a slap. "It's fine," I said. The words were ash in my mouth. I stood up, my chair scraping softly against the flagstone floor. The sound was obscenely loud in the sudden pocket of silence that had fallen over our table. Every eye was on me. I saw pity, curiosity, and in a few of Genevieve's closest friends, a shared, satisfied smirk. This was a spectator sport for them. The taming of the unsuitable fiancé. I picked up my clutch, a small, beaded thing from the 1920s that I had personally restored. Its familiar, solid weight was a small anchor in the rising tide of humiliation. As I walked towards the other table, I could feel Genevieve's voice resume its melodic storytelling, the narrative closing over the space I had occupied as if I had never been there at all. The photographer gave me a sympathetic look as I sat down. He was young, his eyes kind. He didn't understand. Nobody did. They saw a woman being slighted by her future mother-in-law. They didn't see the final, load-bearing strut of a fragile structure snapping in two. For months, I had endured the barbs. The casual mention of my scholarship education, the backhanded compliments about how resourceful I was to make a life for myself without a trust fund. The constant, insidious comparison to the women of Julian's world, women like Chloe, who were bred for this life of effortless luxury, their main occupation being the chairing of charitable galas. I had endured it because I loved Julian. I loved his kindness when we were alone, his easy laugh, the way he saw the world as a place of boundless optimism. But I was seeing now that his kindness was a passive thing. It was a placid lake, beautiful on a calm day, but offering no resistance to the poison being poured into it. He prioritized the absence of conflict over the presence of justice. And in doing so, he made me the price of his peace. A cold clarity began to settle over me, chilling the hot flush of shame. It was a feeling I recognized from my work. It was the moment you step back from a damaged tapestry, the grief and frustration at the ruin giving way to a detached, analytical assessment. You stop seeing the tear, you start seeing the warp and the weft. You stop seeing the problem, you start seeing the solution. I looked back at the head table. It was a perfect tableau of power. Genevieve, radiant in her victory. Chloe, leaning into Julian, her laughter bright and sharp. And Julian, caught between them, smiling a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was already being absorbed back into their world, the brief rebellion of his love for me a forgotten anomaly. He caught my eye for a moment. He gave a small, helpless shrug. It was the shrug that did it. Not the cruelty, not the public humiliation, but that small, pathetic gesture of surrender. It told me everything I needed to know. This would be my life. A lifetime of being moved to the children's table to accommodate the comfort of his past. A lifetime of his apologetic shrugs. A lifetime of being the acceptable sacrifice. A deep, quiet coldness spread through my limbs. It wasn't grief. Grief was a hot, messy thing. This was something else. It was the dissociation of a surgeon before the first cut. The pain was still there, a hot coal in my chest, but it was now compartmentalized, stored away. The emotional part of my brain had shut down, and the strategic part, the part that catalogs, assesses, and acts, had taken over. I looked at Genevieve again. She was holding her wine glass up to the light, admiring the deep ruby color. "A decent vintage," she announced to the table. "But the cellars at the Dupont estate have a 45 that would make you weep." She was a woman who measured the world in acquisitions. Status, objects, people. She had tried to acquire my fiancé, and by extension me. She thought she had succeeded. Her arrogance was her entire operating system. It was the lens through which she saw everything. She saw me as a minor obstacle, easily swept aside. A girl with a quaint job and no pedigree, dazzled by her son's wealth. She couldn't conceive of a world where I held any power she couldn't see, couldn't measure in dollars or social connections. That was her flaw. It was a fatal one. The world is not just made of money and bloodlines. It is also made of history, of knowledge, of secrets kept for generations. And my family were the best secret keepers of all. I had spent the last 10 years of my life building a name for myself on my own terms. Alara Vance, textile conservator. Not Her Royal Highness, Princess Alara of Eldoria, fourth in line to the throne. I had wanted something that was mine, something earned. I had wanted a real life, a real love. I saw now that what I had with Julian was not real. It was a fantasy I had tried to build inside someone else's hostile territory. He was not my partner. He was my warden. And this place, this beautiful, historic estate he and his mother had chosen for our wedding, was to be my gilded cage. I pushed my chair back, the legs silent on the stone this time. The photographer looked up, startled. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm fine," I said. And for the first time all night, it was the absolute truth. The fury was there, but it was no longer a wildfire. It was a contained, controlled burn, fueling a cold engine. I walked out of the conservatory, not towards the exit, but towards the quiet, manicured gardens flanking the main house. The night air was cool on my hot skin. The scent of night-blooming jasmine replaced the suffocating perfume of the orchids. I took out my phone. The screen cast a blue glow on my face. There was only one person to call. He wasn't in my contacts under Uncle Alistair or Royal Secretary. He was simply Finch, a man I knew as a family friend, a quiet academic who had encouraged my passion for history and helped me secure my first apprenticeship, pulling strings I never questioned. A man who respected my desire for a normal life, but had made me promise to call if normal was no longer tenable. My finger hovered over the contact. "Finch." He answered on the first ring, his voice calm and precise, as always. "Alara." He never wasted words on pleasantries. "Alistair," I said, my voice steady. The use of his full first name was our code. It meant the game was over. It meant I was coming home. There was a beat of silence on the other end, not of surprise, but of quiet acknowledgement. "What is the situation?" he asked. I looked back through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the conservatory. I could see the tableau at the head table, a pantomime of happiness. Genevieve was laughing, her head thrown back. Julian was refilling Chloe's wine glass. It was a perfect, beautiful picture of my erasure. "The arrangement is no longer viable," I said, the words tasting like metal. It was the language of statecraft, not heartbreak. It was the only language that felt appropriate now. "I understand," he said. "What are your instructions?" His deference was so complete, so ingrained, that it almost felt jarring after the evening I'd had. To Genevieve, I was a nuisance. To Finch, I was his sworn duty. "The venue," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "The Highgrove Estate. They're very proud of it. It's been in the same family for 200 years. They believe it's priceless. Few things are." Finch replied, a hint of dryness in his tone. "I require it," I said. "Tonight. All of it. The land, the buildings, the contents. And I want all existing contracts voided." Effective immediately, there was a soft tapping sound on his end, the sound of a keyboard. He was a man who moved with terrifying efficiency. "There is a wedding scheduled for tomorrow, I believe," he said. It wasn't a question. He already knew. He knew everything. "Yes," I said. "That event is to be cancelled. Consider it done, Your Highness," he said. The title, one I hadn't heard addressed to me in a decade, landed with the force of a physical blow. It felt foreign and, for the first time, deeply comforting. It was a shield, an armor, a weapon. "Thank you, Finch," I said, and ended the call. I stood there for a moment, the phone cool in my hand. The crickets chirped in the long grass. A breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak tree beside me. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I had walked out of that room a heartbroken fiancé. I would walk back in as the owner. I smoothed down the silk of my simple dress. Genevieve thought it was merely utilitarian. She had no idea. The most utilitarian things are often the most powerful. A simple key can open a castle. A simple word can undo an empire. A simple phone call can buy a rich woman's whole world out from under her, just for the satisfaction of watching her face when she realizes she's trespassing. I turned and walked back towards the light. When I re-entered the conservatory, no one noticed. The party was in full swing. Genevieve was holding court, a champagne flute held aloft like a scepter. I slipped back into my seat at the staff table. The photographer gave me a questioning look. I just smiled, a small, private smile. For the next 20 minutes, I simply watched. I observed Genevieve's performance of matriarchal power, the way she commanded the attention of the room, the casual way she dismissed a waiter with a flick of her wrist. I watched Julian, who was now laughing and deep in conversation with Chloe's father. He looked relaxed, happy. The tension had drained from his shoulders. He had made his choice, and the world had not ended. He thought the crisis was averted. He thought I had accepted my place. The dessert course was being served, a raspberry pavlova with gold leaf dusting the meringue. It was absurdly decadent. Genevieve picked at hers with a tiny silver spoon, declaring it passable. That was when the main doors to the conservatory opened again. This time, it wasn't a guest. It was a man I recognized as Mr. Sterling, the owner of the estate. He was an elderly man with a proud, patrician bearing, his family's legacy woven into every brick and blade of grass of Highgrove. Tonight, that pride was gone. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. He walked directly to the head table, his eyes scanning the guests until they found Genevieve. "Mrs. de Vere," he said, his voice strained. "I must have a word." Genevieve looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "Sterling, can it wait? We're in the middle of a celebration." "I'm afraid it cannot," he said, his voice cracking. He was holding a piece of paper. A fax, it looked like. Antiquated. There appears to have been a transaction. A ripple of interest went through the table. Julian's father, a man who lived and breathed transactions, leaned forward. "What sort of transaction?" Mr. Sterling swallowed hard. He looked like a man who had just been told his god was dead. "The estate," he stammered. "Highgrove. It's been sold." A stunned silence fell over the head table. Genevieve let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Sold? Don't be ridiculous." "To whom?" "We have it booked for the entire weekend. We have a contract. The new owners have invoked a private clause," Sterling said, his eyes darting around nervously. He wouldn't look at any of them directly. "The sale is immediate, and they have instructed me to inform all current guests that the property is now closed. All events, including the wedding scheduled for tomorrow, are canceled." The silence was now absolute. Every guest in the room had stopped talking, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. Genevieve's face had gone from amused disbelief to a mask of cold fury. "That is the most absurd thing I have ever heard," she hissed. Who would have the audacity?" Before Mr. Sterling could answer, the conservatory doors opened for a third time. This time, it was Finch. He was not alone. He was flanked by two men in severe, dark suits. They moved with a quiet, unnerving economy of motion. They were not corporate lawyers. They were something else. Finch's calm gaze swept the room before landing on me. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned his attention to the head table. Finch walked towards the head table with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned not just the room, but the ground it was built on. He held a leather portfolio. The two men with him stood sentinel at the door, their presence transforming the atmosphere from a society dinner to a state proceeding. "Genevieve de Vere?" Finch's voice was quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the silent room. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed. Genevieve stared at him, her lips a thin, white line. "Who are you?" "My name is Alistair Finch," he said. "I am the private secretary to the Royal House of Eldoria. I am here representing the new owners of this property." He placed the portfolio on the table with a soft, definitive thud. "Eldoria?" Julian's father scoffed. "That reclusive little monarchy? What business do they have here?" "Their business is their own," Finch said coolly. "However, as of 9:17 p.m. this evening, this estate became a private holding of the Crown. The purchase was non-negotiable." He gestured to the trembling Mr. Sterling. "Mr. Sterling was made an offer that reflected the gravity of our interest. He wisely accepted." Genevieve's eyes narrowed. The gears of her mind were turning, trying to process this intrusion, this flagrant disregard for her authority. "This is a breach of contract," she snapped. "Our event tomorrow is cancelled." Finch finished for her, his tone flat. "The new owner requires the property for her personal use. Immediately. You have 1 hour to vacate the premises." The collective gasp in the room was audible. Genevieve looked as if she'd been physically struck. "The new owner?" she repeated, spitting the words out. "She? Who is she? Let me speak to her. I will have my husband's lawyers bury this little princess of yours in litigation." Finch's expression didn't change, but a dangerous stillness settled in his eyes. He turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping past Julian, past Chloe, past Genevieve, until it rested, respectfully and deferentially, on me, still sitting at the staff table. And then he did something that shattered their entire world. He bowed, a slight, formal inclination of his head. "As you wish," he said, his voice clear and resonant in the tomb-like silence. "Her Royal Highness is right here." Every head in the room swiveled towards me. I saw Julian's face first. The blood drained from it, leaving his skin a waxy, translucent white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at me as if he'd never seen me before. And, in a way, he hadn't. Then I looked at Genevieve. Her perfectly made-up face crumpled. The arrogant smirk, the condescending pity, the triumphant cruelty, it all dissolved in a wave of pure, uncomprehending shock. The wine glass in her hand slipped from her fingers, hitting the porcelain plate with a sharp crack and shattering. Red wine, the color of blood, bled across the white tablecloth, staining the pristine damask. Her eyes, those arctic blue eyes, were wide with horror. She wasn't looking at a person. She was looking at a ghost, a myth, a force of nature she had casually tried to swat aside, only to find it was a hurricane. She had built her life on a strict hierarchy of power, and she had just discovered she was at the absolute bottom. I stood up from my table and walked slowly towards them. The photographer who had offered me his sympathy now looked at me with something akin to terror. As I passed the other guests, they shrank back, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. They were looking at the source of the disruption, the quiet eye of the storm. I stopped in front of the ruined head table, the smell of spilled wine sharp in the air. I looked at the shattered glass, the spreading crimson stain. A perfect metaphor. I met Julian's gaze. He was still gaping, his mind unable to bridge the chasm between the quiet, unassuming archivist he thought he loved and the woman standing before him. "Alara," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I don't understand, no," I said, my voice calm and even. "You don't. You never did." I turned to Genevieve. She was trembling, her hands clenched in her lap. The mask of the powerful matriarch had been utterly destroyed, revealing the frightened, insecure woman beneath. She had built her identity on a foundation of inherited status, and in a single moment, I had shown her what true, absolute power looked like. It didn't need to boast. It didn't need to perform. It simply acted. "You were concerned about the linens," I said, my voice soft. "Don't be. The collection here is mediocre, but the house has good bones. We'll be replacing everything, of course." I used her own words, her own casual cruelties, and turned them into instruments of a clinical, devastating verdict. The phrase "good bones" hung in the air, an echo of her earlier condescension now repurposed as a declaration of my ownership. Her face contorted in a spasm of humiliation. This was a language she understood perfectly. The language of status, of possessions, of being the one who decides what is worthy and what is to be discarded. Finch stepped forward and addressed the room. "The new owner's security team will now escort everyone from the property. Please gather your belongings. You have 55 minutes. The two men in dark suits moved forward, their presence suddenly an undeniable threat. There would be no argument. There would be no negotiation. This was an eviction. I looked one last time at the wreckage of my former life. At the pale, shocked face of the man I thought I would marry. At the trembling, broken woman who had orchestrated my humiliation. I felt nothing. No triumph, no anger, just a vast, quiet emptiness. The fury had burned itself out, leaving only the cold ash of resolution. I turned my back on them. I didn't need to see their downfall. The knowledge of it was enough. "Finch," I said, without looking back. "Have the car brought around to the front. It's already waiting, Your Highness," he replied. I walked out of the conservatory, my back straight, my head held high. I didn't run. I didn't gloat. I simply left. The most powerful statement one can make is to leave a room you now own, because you have better places to be. Outside, the night was still and cool. A sleek, black car with darkened windows was idling silently at the foot of the grand stone steps. Not a rental, not a taxi. A state car, with discreet flags I hadn't seen in a decade. One of Finch's men opened the door for me. As I slid into the plush leather interior, I glanced back at the magnificent house. My house. Lights were beginning to go out, one by one. The party was over. The weeks that followed were quiet. I did not see Julian or Genevieve. I didn't need to. Finch provided me with concise, daily briefings. The De Vere family's spectacular fall from grace became the stuff of legend in the circles they cared so much about. The story, in all its brutal detail, had spread like wildfire. Genevieve, a woman whose entire self-worth was tied to her social standing, had been rendered a pariah. Invitations to galas dried up. Her calls went unanswered. Friends crossed the street to avoid her. She had been publicly and comprehensively humiliated by the one person she deemed beneath her notice. The humiliation was not just social, it was financial. Julian's father, a man who prided himself on his shrewd investments, discovered that several of his key international partners had deep, long-standing ties to Eldoria's sovereign wealth fund. In a series of quiet, polite, and utterly ruthless phone calls, major lines of credit were pulled. Joint ventures were dissolved. Contracts were reviewed and found wanting. Their empire, which had seemed so unassailable, began to crumble at the edges. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one administered with surgical precision by Finch's office. It turned out that the reclusive little monarchy had its hands in everything from global shipping to tech startups to high fashion. They had been silent partners in the De Vera's world all along. Julian tried to reach me. He sent dozens of emails, left rambling, desperate voicemails. They were a torrent of confusion, regret, and pleas for a second chance. He loved me, he said. He had been weak, a coward. He saw that now. I had them all deleted without listening or reading. His regret was irrelevant. He hadn't loved me enough to defend me when I was just Alara Vance, the textile conservator. He only understood my value once it was displayed in terms he could comprehend.